So he believed that the eternal state was largely marked by holiness and happiness. He found those twin doctrines when when the bodily resurrection happens and the kingdoms fully come, we experience holiness and happiness. That would be his two key motifs of heaven.
Hello and welcome to Theology on the Go. I am Jonathan Master, joined as always by my friend and co-host, James Dalzell. James, how are you today?
I'm doing well, Jonathan. Looking forward to talking about a great hymn writer and more with our guest today.
Yeah, many of our listeners will be familiar with Isaac Watts' hymns, even if you aren't certain of who wrote them. No doubt you've heard and sung many of his hymns. And this little book deals with the piety of Isaac Watts. It's entitled Holiness and Happiness, the Piety of Isaac Watts. And it's edited and there's a little introduction in it written by our guest today, Britt Stokes. Britt is a pastor in Charleston, South Carolina. Britt, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you all for having me. I'm overjoyed to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you. It is an interesting topic. We don't often think about the men behind the hymns that we sing. And so I want to begin there. You explain in the book that there is more to Isaac Watts than the fact that he's simply a great hymn writer. And so the question I wondered is, what should readers know about him in order to understand his piety? And maybe you can even start with a few on his early years.
Yeah, so Watts is a very interesting figure. He obviously came to prominence. His true genius was hymn writing, but he grew up in sort of an English Puritan background and sort of serves as a transitional figure between those Puritans and what we would term a classic evangelical. So Watts has a very key role that we often don't realize, and his English Puritan background had a major effect on his hymn writing. And then obviously, as you mentioned, he over his lifetime was an expansive writer on a number of different things: philosophy, theology. He wrote poetry, all the way down to classic theological works, as we would put it. And so his was able to think through his entire corpus of writing and how he approaches the spiritual life. It's something that you sort of capture as you read the entirety of his work, which is typically in 6 volumes, somewhere over 40 books that he wrote over his lifetime. So,
even your brief description tells us this is a precocious man of many abilities, and yet in one sense he lives his life kind of on the margins of the mainstream, a little bit outside of it, though certainly could have had a fabulous career on the inside of it. And you say a few things about this in your introduction, just with regard to the formative years in his youth, his father's example. How does that shape the kind of man he is, especially in terms of his piety and devotion, which comes through in so many of the selections that you include in this volume?
Yeah, it's a very good question. His father was a devout Puritan dissenter, was actually arrested for being involved in that period of time. There was the ejection of ministers during that period, and it was just a really challenging period for the church. So that is deeply embedded in Watts' thought. You get a lot of what we call classic Puritan ideas that come through with him. And then his approach to the spiritual life, I think, is a big part of that. A big part of that background, a big part of his raising is sort of that focus on individual piety, that focus on an individual relationship with God. Sometimes that generation often gets dinged for that, or they sort of say there is such a focus on the individual piety that sometimes we say maybe they forgot the larger congregational aspect of it, or those things. But a huge part of it comes out in his hymn writing. And then he's involved in a lot of different controversies during that time that sort of shape it as well. So his life was marked by controversy. His life was marked, not him personally, but the world around him, the English Enlightenment. So he comes out of this persecution into the Enlightenment, which are different flavors of that. But it's the Enlightenment was a massive shift in thinking that he was wrestling with, and sort of was standing alone in that. He came a little bit before Edwards and some of the other figures that had a lot to do with that, Christians thinking through that period.
So how I'm thinking of a contemporary of his, someone like John Locke, How would he? What would the trend be in Locke, and how would Watts maybe be resisting it?
Yeah, probably the biggest way he resisted Locke. Locke obviously had issues with total depravity, right? And that was sort of the big issue. Watts was polemical in that sense. He wrote a massive work that dealt with, it's entitled The Ruin and Recovery of Mankind. And so he found value in Locke, but at the same time, he dissented from him in a number of ways, primarily being original sin. Locke was the one that sort of began to question that on a mainstream front. And that sin is a massive thread, the heightened view of sin. And Watts had a very high view of sin, which comes obviously from that Puritan background. And he tried to carry that through. What's interesting about Watts, he wrote a polemical work on that, but it was probably 18 years before Edwards wrote his. And what makes Watts unique, and I think what some people, if you begin to read him outside of his hymns, may misunderstand Watts a little bit, is that he is sort of in the throes of the Enlightenment and did not have a ton of time to process it, because he's trying to be the voice of the church during that period. So he didn't have the luxury of Edwards and others that came just a little bit behind him, where things were fleshed out and ideas had a little bit more time to be thought through.
Britt, when you talk about Watts's piety, you are, I mean, it's in the title, Holiness and Happiness, but you say it this way: the main feature of Watts' approach to the spiritual life is his emphasis on holiness and happiness. What's the doctrinal motivation behind that? Why do holiness and happiness stand out as the sort of twin emphases of Isaac Watts's piety?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's sort of the genesis of it all that you begin to pick up in Watts. He actually saw the spiritual life as eternal life begun. So he didn't use this phrase, but the already but not yet, which has become a common way of understanding it. So he believed that the eternal state was largely marked by holiness and happiness. He found those twin doctrines when the bodily resurrection happens and the kingdoms fully come, we experience holiness and happiness. That would be his two key motifs of heaven. Knowledge and love are part of heaven as well. They help make those two doctrines grow. But because holiness and happiness is the eternal state, is sort of the way he thought about the eternal state, he believed those began in the here and now, and the Christians experience that. Also, so that's the doctrinal basis from it. The contextual basis from that is that he's also he comes from that Puritan background where holiness is a major theme, something that's talked about doctrinally. But happiness, again, he's affected by his context like many historical figures. He's dealing with that term happiness, which was a major issue during the Enlightenment period, where it began to be understood in terms of individual, sort of the American dream comes out of that, right? So he's trying to turn that back towards a theological, God-centered approach, if that makes sense.
Two things occur to me. One, his health, which was reputedly not robust by any measure, and then also the persecuted condition of his life as a nonconformist. How in your reading of Watts and your work on Watts, you've done doctoral work on Watts. Is this part of what forms that heavenly mindedness? I'm thinking of even like a major treatise of his on the world to come. And even in the selections on piety here, and even picking these themes, these are both eschatological realities. This isn't like faith and hope, which are good and they have their place, but these will fall away. But these are the abiding things. Does his context as a nonconformist and maybe as a frail man, in your reading, does that bear on this heavenly mindedness?
I without question, that's very astute of you to pick up on that. I've been in Watts now for 3 or 4 years, still in him heavily, and without question, as a Watts scholar, I believe that's true. I mean, he pastored John. Most folks don't know this. He pastored John Owen's church, the same church that Owen pastored, and he got to the point where he was so ill that they had to bring on a co-pastor, and then for the rest of his life, he was there some, but largely he was alone. He moved in with a family there in England, and he wrote, and he was ill a lot. We get a lot of it from his letters. So there's no question that he was very acquainted with with death, with those thoughts. And I think there's no doubt that it bared on his mind. And certainly growing up in that context where he saw people suffer for the faith, a major part of it. So all throughout his writings, the work that you mentioned was a major piece of his corpus that was very popular in his days. It was broadly disseminated across the world. Really, I think it's no doubt that that's a major part of how he began to understand the spiritual life here and now.
As a I'm asking you this as a pastor and a scholar who's put together some of these. How do you think, especially these selections on death and the future life, how can they help readers now?
Yeah, there's probably a couple things here. First of all, I think when the past, we are able to deal with different contexts. So Watts is in a context that could be helpful for us because it's arguable, are we headed back to a similar context as Christians, particularly in the West? So I think it's helpful to touch base with someone that was in a little bit different context and maybe has something to say about where we're headed. The second part of it is that it helped me as I thought through it and wrote through Watts extensively, and you're deep in this, to think that there is a world to come. And I tell my congregations and often people that I teach that Christians generally live with an eternal perspective. You get it even in Hebrews. We live for a cities to come, right? And Watts understands that, and he brings it to bear on our life in a way that I think is incredibly helpful, or at least it was to me.
Britt, I'm always curious when someone does the kind of work that you've done in this book, and the further scholarship that you've engaged in on Isaac Watts. How is it that you became particularly interested in studying Watts? Did you come at him simply on the basis of appreciating his hymns? And what has sort of kept you drawn to Isaac Watts? You mentioned that you've been kind of taking a deep dive for at least 3 years now.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's interesting. I stumbled into Watts beginning in my doctoral studies. Actually, was reading might sound crazy. I was reading a book that detailed the library of Patrick Henry, one of the American founding fathers, and he had a volume of Isaac Watts in his library. And it dawned on me then, I knew Watts from his hymns, but it dawned on me then, this is the man that impacted scores of people on both sides of the Atlantic. And then when you begin to dive into him, you realize we don't know much about him out there. And then the further you get into Watts, you realize he's an absolutely fascinating figure. The world of Christianity, a lot revolved around Watts, and he sort of stands alone in this period of time. Most people don't know this, but he almost single-handedly funded the libraries at Yale and Harvard with his books. He was a major player in that. He was a literary publisher. He published one of Edwards' famous works. I mean, he just had a lot. He was a big figure, and so it's kept me very intrigued. And his thought is interesting because probably from a more intellectual standpoint, his engagement with the early stages of the Enlightenment, which we're experiencing some changes in our culture now that are as massive, but I don't think folks understand how much of a shift in the paradigms and how much pastors and theologians during that time wrestle with them. So that is a very fascinating part to me. How is he dealing with largely one of the biggest intellectual changes to ever come about? So it's been interesting to figure out and see. I've learned a lot from how he's interacted with a lot of changes so I've learned more from Watts, from things that he may have done wrong sometimes as well too, which is why history is very fascinating to me.
So any particular favorites, any play, if someone wants to get a little bit beyond just seeing his name at the bottom of the page in a hymnal and read some of the significant things that he has written. And one of the points that I think we would underscore is that he wrote significant works in his time. What's a good place to start, or what's been your favorite?
Yeah, he's got a number of works that stand out to me. One is a guide to prayer. It's been reprinted. He was dealing with there was controversy over prayer, but it's a very, very helpful, incredibly helpful manual to prayer. Watts was great because he wrote from a pastoral perspective. All of this stuff isn't sometimes Edwards folks can get lost in that, but Watts is good because most of his stuff is accessible. Another one that's really great that I'm working on now that's to come, so to speak, is he wrote a work on the love of God, for the Christian's love of God, that's incredibly helpful. Really, really, really wonderful work. So that'll be maybe coming down the pipe later. And then, as James mentioned, A World to Come was one of his fantastic works. Just really vivid, beautiful details. You've got a hymn writer that details the eternal state, and it just makes it come alive in a very interesting and helpful way, I think.
Well, Britt, I think your book and the selections that you've curated here for readers should also. I'll add this in. Jonathan, you asked him about Watts books, but I'll add the book edited by Britt Stokes. The various selections in this should whet the appetite for the more long form version of Watts maybe to follow. Really glad you put this together. I think I can see this book. Maybe this is your intention. I can see this book serving as devotional reading. It's a nicely produced small book. It can sit on the bedside table or near your favorite chair for coffee in the morning, and really move your meditations in a godly and heavenly direction. Really grateful for your work putting this together.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's exactly right. I really appreciate it, James.
Britt, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate you giving us some of your time, and we really would commend these selections and this little work to our listeners. And so we appreciate you joining us.
Thank you, Jonathan. It was my pleasure to be here.
Well, James, this is a welcome little volume. Is worth reading, worth understanding better, that many Christians have heard of because of his hymn writing, but I don't think they appreciate the scope of his work and of his life.
Yeah, and I think this is a nice little on-ramp to considering Watts, his greater contribution, especially his works of Christian piety that could be really useful for Christians now, just seeking to have their hearts stirred and their minds focused. And I think that Britt Stokes does a good job in culling out just some really tasty morsels. Maybe that's a way to describe this book.
Yeah, it's a taste. It's kind of a little sampling.
And this is in a series, Profiles in Reformed Spirituality, published by Reformation Heritage Books. And again, I think the whole series has been really, really excellent in achieving that very aim of Reformed spirituality, what it looks like, introductions, but also samples of original text. And so I think this little book will be, I would say, great gift. It's the kind of gift you could give to a young Christian or to a Christian who isn't very literary, perhaps, and you want to encourage them to read more, but you don't want to overwhelm them. This would be a great book to kind of get the heart and mind moving in the right direction, but in an accessible and non-intimidating format.
Well, because of our friends at RHB, we have a few of these copies to give away. And so if you'd like to enter to win a copy of this book, Holiness and Happiness, the Piety of Isaac Watts, you can do that by going to placefortruth.org, clicking on the Theology on the Go link, and there's a spot there for you to enter your information for the opportunity to win one of these copies that we have. If you're able to support the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, we rely on your financial support. You can do that at placefortruth.org or also at alliancenet.org. There are donate buttons at the top of both of those sites. And if you're able to spread the word about Theology on the Go, if you know people who might be interested in it, please pass it along, and pass along to us any suggestions or feedback that you have. If you're able to rate and review the podcast on whatever vehicle you download it, that would be a big help to us. And as always, thank you for listening to Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.